Hey everybody, my guests today are Sarah Malanowski and Nicholas Baima, and we're going to talk about why it's okay to be a gamer. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
So why is it okay to be a gamer?
One way to think about this question is so in a very, there's the weak way. Is it okay to be a gamer? It's is it permissible to be a gamer? And it's sure. Many people aren't objecting to being a gamer if we're thinking about permissibility. But then we can think about the stronger way of asking the question. Does being a gamer enhance your life? Does it help your life go better? And that's the question we're interested in answering. And so the strategy for the book is to look at common objections against gaming. And then someone described it as intellectual aikido. It's where you reverse those objections and turn them into positives. The common objections are violence, gaming is violent. The new objection is it's addictive. And then, you're a loner if you game. And then, finally, probably the most, I think, underrated or underappreciated objection is that it's a waste of time, because I think that's really pervasive. And you can show that it's not addictive or not violent, but someone still might think it's a waste of time. And so the strategy for the book is to reverse all of those objections and to say the positive things. And I'll just say we can go through each of them, but very briefly, video games is a way to make friends, be a part of a diverse community, and to develop and engage with interesting aesthetic properties to develop your intellect, and to simply have fun, which is important for the good life.
So let's kind of go through these objections one by one. Violence. Is there evidence that suggests that video games make people more violent?
There is evidence. What's actually kind of interesting is that currently the APA, the American Psychological Association, does seem to hold that there's data to show that video games are contributing to aggression, or there's some relationship between video games and aggression. And then there's kind of a complicated story about what's the relationship between aggression and violence, and so that's kind of a question. That's an issue of operationalizing things in order to be able to study them. And so the APA does seem to hold that there is this connection. If you actually look at the empirical data, it's not super strong. So there's definitely reason to doubt that particular claim. And so if you actually look at the studies, there's going to be studies that try to demonstrate the actual causal connection. If I play a violent video game, then immediately after, am I going to act more aggressively? And so that and there you're getting the you're actually manipulating I did this video game and then now I'm doing this. And so that's getting you that causal connection that you want to do. But if you look at those actual causal studies, they're actually they're a little bit silly, because you can't it would be really unethical to subject participants to anything that's actually going to make them actually violent, right? And so the actual the studies to actually demonstrate the causal connection are things if you play a violent video game, are you going to mix spicier hot sauces immediately following the video game, versus playing a calm video game, right? And it turns out that yes, statistically, you're more likely to mix a slightly or spicier hot sauce if you played a violent video game. And the idea here is you're acting more aggressively, and with playing the video game caused you to, because that was the variable. But of course, we're not really worried about mixing spicy hot sauces in the real world, right? And so making then having to the external validity, right? So going from that claim to if video games cause actual real world violence is a little bit weak, right? And so those are the types of studies we're looking at when we make those claims. And so I think there's good reason to kind of call that claim into question.
That is really funny. I did not know about the spicy hot sauce studies. Sometimes when I hear about psychological studies, I think to myself, who thought of that? Somebody thought of conducting that type of experiment or that type of study because they thought that it was a valid way of, measuring whatever it is. Like in this case, it would be aggression. And that just sounds very odd to me,
There's other issues too, like I guess they're conceptual issues about like what exactly would constitute a violent video game.
Yeah, so I think that's a huge issue, right? So no one's going out into the world and saying, like, my favorite video games are violent video games, right? So, like, pretty much every video game has some aspect of violence in it. It's not like a monolithic category of video games. And it turns out that, like, the games that involve some aspect of violence usually are also the more exciting games. And so then you get the confounding variables of, like, are games that are more exciting, which also happen to have violence, like those might make me more frustrated. And that might be what's tied to aggression or something like that.
Related to that is like whether or not the violence is attached to like a narrative. So like just like mindless violence or violence done in hate versus like you being a hero. Like those things aren't like controlled for, like especially if you're doing like a broad study. So like, yeah, I mean, I think there's like a whole host of issues. I think in the book it's important to, and this is like, Sarah does like the empirical stuff. I didn't do that stuff. And so she it's important to show that to be honest about the evidence, and that involves like showing its strengths and weaknesses. But I think that the violence objection misses like the larger point of like, so we're coming at it from a virtue ethics approach. And on the one hand, like it's not to the violence objection gets right that video games can shape our character in the way that like any media can shape our character. Any cultural influence surely has an effect on us. The mistake in it is it's like kind of reductive in how it's like thinking about the violence. Like you see this, then you directly do that. And, Plato, like I study Plato and I'm a huge fan of Plato, and he seems to have maybe made that mistake as well. Going back to his Republic, kind of one transition we make is to show like the violence objection doesn't hold, but it does get something right in that video games are shaping our character. And in fact, when we think about the toxic behavior in the gaming community, or even like the positive behavior, the violent video games have nothing to do with that, really. It's more about like the social setting or like how you treat other players. And so it's not really like the content of the game that is tied to like the hostility or even the good side of a gaming community.
Is there any studies that try to establish the supposed causal link between violent behavior and violence in video games or a video game playing? Like, is it that people who tend to be more violent anyway tend to play violent video games?
I mean, so that's definitely a possibility. So when it comes to making those types of claims, so obviously you want to avoid that possibility of like it's just the case that like people who are just more violent are drawn to those games. So like what I talked, the spicy hot sauce study is an attempt to like directly establish the causal link by showing like, here's one condition where we give a violent video game, and here's another condition where we give a peaceful game or whatever, just like doing crossword puzzles or something, and then you do the direct comparison to like the behavior afterwards. And so those types of that's like a causal study that's trying to show the specific causal link, and that's trying to avoid the those confounding variables of like background. The other type of study is just getting at correlation, and this is like looking at longitudinal stuff. So like if you look at, do people who tend to play more video games, more violent video games, in the long run, are they going to be more aggressive? So like one way of trying to control for just the personality type being drawn is to try to do those direct causal studies, but then you get those kind of like silly outcome variables of like mixing spicy or hot sauce. But if you try to do the longitudinal studies, like just doing the correlation, you run into like additional types of problems. You would expect when you're looking at long-term stuff, like playing violent video games in general leading to more like real world acts of violence. If you look at that data, it doesn't really seem to hold. So one thing that you can look at is like when you release like a popular violent video game. So if those games really were like causing people to go out in the real world and do more violent acts, then you would expect that you would see a surge in real world violence right after the release of a popular video game because millions of people are playing this game, right? But it actually turns out the relationship goes the opposite way. So when a really popular violent video game title is released, you actually see like a small downtick in violent acts, like if you're actually looking at real world violent acts. And so, who knows what's going on there, but it's whatever's going on. It's not a clear relationship between like people play violent video games and then they go out in the world and, stab people or whatever.
So when I hear video games and addiction, I think about loot boxes. Maybe they've learned from the gambling industry how many rewards to grant out per, like dollar that you spend or something like that, or per hour that you spend at the game. It's like just enough to entice you to keep playing, right? So is that what people are talking about?
You can think about that, and you can also just think it's tied to it, but also just like the games that are incredibly grinding. And then like anecdotally, or I don't even, people like describe themselves as being addicted to games or like feeling like compulsively, like they're compelled to keep playing. And there are like, stories of people playing for extremely long hours to like ill health. So this is like reason to think that they have, there's something about the games that have addictive properties. And I think you're right that the loot box resembles gambling. And so if gambling is addictive, then it would follow that video games, at least that part that resemble gambling, are addictive. Like our view is that there is such a thing as problematic gaming. And there are even specific features of games that are problematic, but it doesn't quite fit the addiction model in the right way. And so it's actually more misleading than helpful to say it's addictive. And so like there's like complicated reasons, like the actual addictive model, it doesn't resemble it. The other reason is that it's like it has therapeutic elements to it, unlike like other forms of addiction. But I think like one of the more interesting claims is you could remove the loot boxes from video games, but I mean maybe it's like a difficult question, but I don't think you could actually remove the gambling elements from gambling and still gamble. And so what that shows is that like the feature of video games that might be problematic can actually be pulled out of it. This is where gamers disagree. My opinion is that when that occurs, the games improve. But, I've heard other gamers say things like, I really just want to grind.
I'm not a person who likes to grind. I really don't like it, but I do see the appeal of something like loot boxes. And it does resemble gambling to some extent because there's that random number generator, right, that's there. And I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of like learned from the gambling industry of like what that ratio has to be in order to get people to play the game. Another thing that strikes me is that it doesn't seem to be anything special about video games, right? Because you could, I guess, be addicted to a number of other activities. Like if you just found an activity extremely fun, are we willing to say that somebody can be addicted to it?
So I agree with you that there might be a stigma, or I don't know if this is what you're saying, but there might be a stigma against video games, which like make society target it as addictive, whereas like rock climbing, right? But I will say like one thing in favor of like the negativity of video games, and I don't know if this is a bad thing, but like you physically cannot like rock climb for like, I don't know, all day, right? There's going to be like a physical limit. And there is a physical limit to how much you can play video games. But because it's like not requiring the total body in the same way as like rock climbing. You can do that. You can play video games for a much longer time. And so you might think like that is one reason why you might like single it out.
But then you could do like, so we have a colleague who writes romance novels as like a side gig. And so she like told the story about how like people can just be addicted to romance novels. Like they'll just like consume them in like huge amounts, right? So that might be more analogous. Like there's not like a physical limit to how much you do romance novels. But so like, okay, so one thing that is also that's interesting about gaming compared to other activities that are fun and like people might do a lot is that gaming is actually unique among behaviors aside from gambling in that it's actually diagnosable as an addiction. So it's included in the World Health Organization's classification of psychiatric illnesses currently as internet gaming disorder. It's in the conditions for future study in the current DSM-5. It's actually a possibility that like that gaming addiction could be a real addiction, diagnosable in a way that other behavioral addictions are not currently accepted by the psychiatric community as being real illnesses or real diseases. And so gaming addiction as a diagnosis is currently modeled off of other addiction diagnoses. And so in order to be diagnosed with it, you're going to have to fit a certain set of behavioral criteria, which are basically the same set of criteria that you would have to fit if you were going to be diagnosed with a substance use disorder or with a gambling disorder. And so thinking about behaviors as being addictions is a newer thing, right? So gambling was the first one, and now gaming is following in suit. And so we might wonder, to what extent are behaviors actually addictions in the way that substances can be addictions? It does seem like gambling in particular does fit the addiction model. And our argument in the book is like there are to the extent that gaming incorporates those gambling aspects like loot boxes, it does seem like you could be addicted. But you would be addicted to the gambling aspect rather than the gaming aspect. And so one thing that we try to argue in our chapter on addiction is that, like Nick mentioned before, there's something different about gaming versus gambling and versus substance use addictions, in that you could take out the addictive element from gaming. You could take out the loot boxes. You can't take out the addictive element from doing heroin, right? Like that would no longer be doing heroin. You can't take out the addictive element of gambling because you would no longer be gambling. Whereas you could take out the loot boxes from gaming and still have a perfectly good game. And I think arguably you'd probably have a better game. Although the grinding aspects, if you enjoy grinding, you might not enjoy the grinding aspect and not like the gambling, like randomness aspect. And then gaming, additionally, I think it's important to keep in mind, and this is what is going to distinguish it from other things that could be addictive or you could be diagnosed with as addictive, as being an addiction. Like if you are going through like a really troubling part of your life, like you're feeling isolated or like you're being bullied, you're just like feeling really down about yourself, and you turn to gaming as your activity to like relieve stress and make you feel better about yourself, like the actual gaming could potentially make your life go better. Like you could make friends when you're otherwise isolated or being bullied. Like you could improve your skills in the game. That could build confidence. You could be somebody of importance in the gaming world. Whereas if you turn to other addictive things like gambling or substances, like doing that is not going to make your life go better. It's not going to improve your condition. And so I think that that's a huge difference between gaming and other things that you can be diagnosed with as being addictive.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's important to kind of distinguish gaming as an activity from other potentially addictive activities. I would agree that the loot box element or the gambling aspect of gaming is not necessary to gaming. Part of the discussion is a little frustrating to me because when people talk about video games, they paint with a broad brush, right? So like video games come in all shapes and sizes. They come in all different forms, right? So there are games which are more violent and less violent. There are games that have more loot boxes and no loot boxes, right? And so when we talk about video games, it seems, at least the people who are critical, they tend to criticize video games themselves because there's something intrinsic about video games that is bad, whereas it's actually the other elements that perhaps are bad, like the addictive element to it. So I want to get to the waste of time criticism because I feel like it's something that I'm kind of sympathetic to. But again, right, it depends on the video game, right? What I would say, it depends on what you're playing and it depends how you're playing, right? So there's like what and then the how. And I would say for most people, the way that they game, I don't know if I would say that it's part of like the best life. And I get that feeling when I game myself. You know, if I game for a couple of hours, I don't feel like that I spent those 2 hours well. You know, like I don't feel good after. But I don't know if it's because of the intrinsic nature of playing video games or if it's because I've internalized the stigma.
So I was a college athlete. I was reasonably successful Division I college wrestler. So some of those are like some of my favorite memories, but also is like staying up to like I know I should be in bed. I have work the next day, but I'm like, it's like 2 a.m. and I've been trying to complete something with my cousin and brother playing like Destiny 1. And then like we like beat this raid boss and it just feels amazing. You know, the struggle, the fact that they're like my friends and all the silliness of the gaming, like, I don't know, I mean, that's on par with like my successes as like an athlete. And not in terms of achievement. I don't think it was like as difficult, but I'm just saying like in terms of like enjoyment, like what I felt with them was just as enjoyable. Maybe not as like, it's definitely not as high as like a measure of success or anything. I'm not saying that, but I think I don't feel like it was a waste of time. Maybe I shouldn't have been doing it during like the weekday before like a lecture I wasn't like fully prepared for and all that. But
so one thing is like, I do think that there's some like internalization of like stereotypes about gaming. So that can make you feel bad about the way like you spending your time gaming. So we call this the man-child's objection to gaming in our book because like, you know, people who are spending all their time gaming, you might think of them as like being man-children, kind of like in their parents' basement with like the Cheeto fingers and everything. Like that's kind of like a stereotype we attach to gamers. And so you might feel like I don't want to be a man-child. And so like I just spent like 3 hours, you know, sitting in my chair just playing this game. And so one of the things we argue is like there is like a social sort of stigma attached to gaming that isn't attached to other hobbies like, you know, biking or reading novels or whatever. So where you'd be kind of like proud to tell your friends or, you know, say in a job interview that, you know, my hobby is second language learning or my hobby is reading literature. You'd feel proud of that. Usually when it comes to gaming, you wouldn't necessarily feel proud of the fact that, you know, you beat the last raid boss in WoW on mythic difficulty after spending literal months working on it. Just something I do. I don't which is that what I do. I do WoW raiding. So I wouldn't necessarily feel, you know, proud of telling people that. And so one reason you might wonder, well, why? Like, you know, why do we not feel like gaming is a good hobby or something to be proud of? And so one of the things we argue is that it's because of the way that it's like because of the mistaken way we tend to value things. Like, so we put value on things that are instrumentally valuable, like they're going to bring about some measurable outcome, like more money or job success or something like that. And so that we argue is kind of the wrong way to, or it's not the thing that's really valuable. So like the things that are instrumentally valuable are not the things that are really valuable. The things that are really valuable are the things that are intrinsically valuable. They're valuable in themselves. And so we argue that if you can kind of like flip the way that you think about value, so society tends to put value on the money making things, the like things that are going to bring you these like awards and like outward measurements of success. If you kind of flip your notion of value to one that emphasizes intrinsically valuable things or the development of, character or intellectual values, then gaming could be an activity that is valuable in that sense, because gaming can lead to intellectual development. It can be an aesthetic experience, etc. And so one response is like, maybe the reason that you think it's a bad hobby is because it's you're just thinking about value in the wrong way. Now I think that you could I mean, I think there's also better and worse ways you can spend your gaming time for sure, right? Like, there's certainly like, I feel like I've wasted my time gaming before if I've, spent 3 hours just like jumping 400 times in order to get a stupid achievement. That's probably a waste of time, right? But like the hours I've spent like, working on beating raid bosses and, like, like trying to perfect my skills in the game, I don't think that's a waste of time at all. I think I've done something valuable.
Yeah, I think the distinction between instrumentally and non-instrumentally valuable goods is important here, because you may think like, well, the fact that they're enjoyable, that makes them good, and we shouldn't only think about instrumental goods, right? Like I think it is easier for people to acknowledge the value of something if it can make you more money, right? Or if it can get you more prestige. Like I feel like everybody can kind of grasp the value of that, right? But just for example, playing a game because it's fun, right? It's almost like we devalue it, even though you may think that fun and enjoyment is one of the highest goods that human beings can experience. And this kind of gets me to the other point that you mentioned, which is, like maybe you're playing this game, but you're playing it with friends, right? You're working together to beat this boss, and then you beat it, and then it's like one of the most memorable experiences that you have in your life. I wonder if that's the social aspect of it, though, right? So like kind of going back to what I said earlier, there's like the what of play and the how of play. So I think overall, maybe like social games are more valuable than perhaps single player games, because there's not that element of cooperation. I used to play Counter-Strike, right? And Counter-Strike, it's a first-person shooter, so I would classify it as a violent game. But I would always play it with friends, either over the internet, or we would go to like a place and have a LAN party or something like that. And when I was with them face to face, it was always more enjoyable and fulfilling than when we were playing only over the internet. And I think it is because there was that social aspect. It was a more intimate space when we played together physically in the same room. So I'm wondering, if we remove that element, then does it therefore make the activity less meaningful and fulfilling?
I think that's a great question. And I think it connects to like the point you made earlier that, video games is a broad category and there's so many different types of games. And that's one of the difficulties, in writing the book, is it's a defense of being a gamer. And like some of the chapters seem more like a defense if you're playing like a social or online multiplayer game. But I think that there are aspects to single player game that make it worthwhile in itself. So, I mean, it obviously depends upon the nature of the game, but we can think about, games that have narratives, like obviously if they have like a terrible story that's like poorly written and the gameplay is terrible, I don't know how much value it has, but games often do have interesting stories. And even if they are kind of derivative, we talk about Detroit Become Human. I don't think it's that original of a story in that it's about whether or not like AI like should have rights in the future. And it's also kind of like gesturing at like racial relations of the past and things like that. You might think that the aspect of like the gameplay tied to the narrative gives you a unique aesthetic experience, in that it has branching mechanics. The way in which you like if you make a choice, then this will happen. If you made a different choice, then something else would have happened. It's also the way in which you're receiving information in the story is both like, so through cutscenes, but also you discover items and then read about them. Characters, you go up and you talk to them. So there's an exploration. So that's just to say, like, you could have a story that's somewhat derivative, but when you combine it with gameplay, you do get a unique way of telling a story. And so that's going to be important for single player games. And then with respect to like non-narrative based games, there's also like unique aesthetic experiences tied to gameplay itself. And I think Nguyen's new book, I should know the name. It's like Agency as Art, Games Agency as Art. And he does a great job in showing how gaming, like one way of thinking about it as an art form is that it's essentially like playing with agential experiences. Different when you play like, so for example, like an easy example is like if you play like the same game, but you play as one character where you're given like tons of abilities which make you like strong. That gives you one experience. But then imagine that you play like a weaker character whose abilities are through like sneaking and stealth. That gives you a different experience. So it's just to say that in both narrative-based games and non-narrative-based games, there is a unique aesthetic experience that one can have in single-player games. And in fact, it might be the case that playing alone allows for a heightened sense of that story and gameplay. So I think like both, like we can talk more about like whether gaming friendships are real friendships or whatnot, but I just want to make the point that I think single player games can also have value too.
This conversation just makes me think about like what makes a video game, right? Because again, the genres they're diverse, right? And it seems to be that it's a game that's played via a video and audio apparatus. So let's consider chess, right? Which is typically a board game. But if you play chess on an iPad, that would therefore be a video game. Would you agree with that?
I mean, kind of sidestep this. I mean, so it is a great question. These kind of like, what is X questions? I would just say like, so taking like a Wittgensteinian approach where it's like, how do we use this term? And I don't, maybe I'm wrong, but like people playing online chess usually don't refer to themselves as gamers. They refer to themselves as like chess players. Same with like bridge. Like if you were an online bridge player, I don't think you would call yourself a gamer. Now, like then we could ask like the question like, well, maybe we're wrong. Maybe they really are a gamer. What I would want to know, it's not that video games like as a medium need to be entirely unique to be like a video game. But if it is just like a replication of what you do with a board, then I do think it's like missing out. But if there's like something unique that mode of playing brings to it, then I am more interested in exploring whether, like maybe it is a video game in that sense.
I talk about gaming in my dissertation because I wrote it on the development of human potential. And I essentially kind of defend the value of video games, but I think it depends on the how and the what, right? So consider a video game that's just like really dumb, and it's really dumb because it's so simple. Something like, I don't know, tic-tac-toe, but maybe it's like on the computer. Like the skill ceiling is very low, right? Like once you learn the strategy, you can kind of like make optimum moves, right? Within like 5 minutes. And then every game leads to a tie, right? Whereas other things like chess, it has a very high skill ceiling, right? Or games like Go, right? Very high skill ceiling. You can always get better at the thing. So in terms of just like how they can develop your potential, they would differ depending on their complexity. What do you think about that?
There's this objection, right? The man-child objection. Gaming is a waste of time. We give two responses to it. And so far, we've really only like kind of like talked about the one. So the one response is actually it's we model it off of philosophy. So we say like philosophy too faces the man-child objection. It's not useful. And so here's like some strategies philosophers have taken to responding. And gaming too can make those responses. It can have intellectual, aesthetic value, etc. And so I think like that fits all of what you're saying. But then like there's this further question like, okay, so like imagine you're playing like a really dumb game or it's a really great game, but you just like to walk in circles. Like you're playing your own version of the game, right? Is that a waste of time? And I want to say not, maybe not, because, and this leads into the second response. So in the book, we argue that there's a virtue of play, like being playful, or it doesn't just have to be playing games, but the good life involves play. Can't all be work. And in one of the nice things about play is that it's an expression of freedom and autonomy, because it's the removal of the constraints. It doesn't involve necessity. And so in the domain of play, like pure play, I just want to say, like, if you enjoy walking in that circle, right, insofar as you are like actualizing the virtue of play, it is like a good thing for you. Now, like, if you don't actually enjoy it, if you find it like burdensome or stupid, or you yourself feel like it's a waste of time, then I would say let's find a better game for you. But you should be playing something, and you should really figure out what it is you want to play. I'll help, but so even that's just to say, like, even stupid games could be of value because they instantiate or exercise play, and play is a human good. It's good for pretty much every animal.
Interesting. So you're saying that play is a virtue. So, like, a virtue understood in an Aristotelian sense, that is a positive character trait, a positive disposition. So the person who possesses a play virtue is playful.
Aristotle, it's like eutrapelia, and it gets translated as wit. It probably should be. So when he first introduces it, it's broader, and it seems to involve like being playful generally. And then later on, when he discusses it in detail, he just seems to have in mind like being witty. But like, let's like leave aside what he said, and just think about it like how he could have understood like the element of being playful or having play in your life. And there's like ways to fail at that, right? So like playing too much, playing too little, those are like the obvious ways. But then there's like other ways, like maybe when you're playing, you feel like you're actually working, right? And I think a lot of modern gamers feel that way, right? We feel burdened by the in-game activities, yet we still want to do them. And I think that's a failure of play, because you're losing sight that like essentially your play has become work. I mean, we could just do like a brief thought experiment. Imagine someone who was successful, good in other domains, but they had no element of play in their life. Would that life be missing out on something? So my answer is yes, but I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on how we're defining play. Is that just engaging in an activity because it's fun?
Well, it's like, yeah, I mean, in some sense, yeah, but it's like what you are choosing because you find it like it's not because of any sort of like external thing it's gonna bring you, right? Like you might think like I'm gonna play like, you know, this math game because it's kind of fun, but also it's gonna help me improve my SAT score or something. But like that wouldn't really be like if you're doing it because it's going to like optimize you in some way, like that wouldn't be you hitting like the virtue of play like effectively, right? So it has to be something that you really are choosing because like freely because it is what you find enjoyable.
So to add to that, so yeah, you would say like it's in the domain of leisure, right? So it has to be a leisurely activity. I would want to exclude things like philosophy from play, even though I think philosophy probably does constitute a leisurely activity, but maybe it is play. I would maybe tie it to it should be connected to amusement in some sense. And so that might be why philosophy is excluded. But I'm confident that it needs to be a leisurely activity, and that I would want to make it more narrow to exclude. But like I think like playing guitar could be a form of play.
I think there has to be like some amount of unseriousness to it. So I think perhaps philosophy could be play if you're asking like is like a taco a sandwich? Like, I think that there's something like philosophical about those like silly questions. So like maybe there is something like silly or unserious about play, and maybe there's like philosophy could fit in, or some philosophical questions could fit in. I don't know.
And adding that though, but there is kind of like almost a paradox here. So it's like you can't be too serious, but you also have to be like serious enough to be engaged in activity. What I mean like is like, imagine we all like, okay, let's play, I don't know, a 3-person game of volleyball. That seems, and the whole time we're playing, Sarah's just like playing with the sand. Like, so she's like, and she's just like, well, aren't we playing? Like, I didn't thought this was supposed to be like fun. And it's like, well, she hasn't committed enough to volleyball to actually count as being engaged in the activity. So it is like, you can't be hyper serious. You have to be able to detach and be like, it's just a game. But you also have to be like focused and engaged enough, which is a kind of seriousness, to actually be doing the activity. So it is this like kind of interesting sweet spot being playful requires.
Interesting. The first thing that comes to mind when you say that is people yelling at each other over the internet because their teammates didn't do what they were supposed to do, So like all that toxicity that comes from some online communities, maybe they're not playing a game, right? Maybe they're taking the game too seriously, right? And then you as the teammate did something bad that negatively affected their team's performance, and now they're like verbally abusing you.
So they're playing a game, but they're not hitting the virtue of play, I think.
One of the things that this is maybe like deviating from like what we say in the book, and like maybe we don't get into this, and this is just something like I've been wondering about when I think about my experiences. I'm not in favor of like hateful or any of that kind of like speech or anything, but like there are like times when I like can't sleep because like the game pissed me off and like I'm so invested in the outcome, and then we failed at the end, and then maybe I got in a dumb childish argument with my brother, and I do feel disappointed in myself for that. But like part of this is like what makes like, so this is moving away from the book, but like part of me, like despite not being able to sleep, like I love it. Like give me more of that. Like I'm excited. Like that makes me want to live. Like I want to get like frustrated and angry and try again. And like I'll be thinking about this all day tomorrow at work and just waiting to like come home and play. Now maybe this is like me like revealing the vicious aspects of me, or maybe this is like some amount of play like can involve, I don't know, the excitement, disappointment, frustration, anger. Maybe that one thing good about it is it allows for a safe space for that to, I really don't know what to think about this, but that's just at least my experience.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how you could play a game but not exhibit the virtue of playfulness. It's interesting. And so you may think that, well, the reasons why games are good, well, maybe one of the main reasons why games are good is because they allow you to be playful. And so to the extent that you take the game too seriously, you're missing out on that, even though like you're playing the game. But you may be gaining in other aspects, right? Because maybe the game is very beautiful, and so there's aesthetic value to it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's all sorts of trade-offs, or you might like, it might be developing your intellectual abilities in certain ways. I would say like, for me, I think like getting too angry, saying mean things to other things, like I would say like those are usually failures of other virtues. Like they might be failures of playfulness, but those are like oftentimes like other virtues can express the failures there. For me, like the modern gamer, when they feel like controlled or like that they have to do this, like, so Sarah described like jumping like hundreds of times to get an achievement. Like, I don't know if that's like an actual example, but like
it is.
Okay. I think that's like a common experience, and it's like, so she's treating her playtime as work. because there's necessity there. And so I think that is like so like playing too much, playing too little, but also this, like when your playtime becomes work, that's a failure of the virtue of being playful.
Yeah, I have gaming friends who will be like eager to get through their like World of Warcraft like chores so they could go play another game. Like they're like, we gotta do this so we can go do this other game we want to play more. And so like they really are treating like their World of Warcraft chores as work, right? So that's not hitting the virtue of play, right? Because they're treating play as work.
I wonder if there's an addictive element there, though, right? Because I've done that before, too. It's like, oh, I have to log into this game to reap my daily rewards, and then I can do something else that I would rather be doing because that other thing is more fun.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's definitely ties to the addictive elements of games there. Like if they're to the extent to which you have to do something, otherwise you're going to miss out on. That definitely that's one of the addictive aspects of games for sure. And so, I mean, one thing you might think like, so game designers design their games so often so like people will play more, right? And so like they're encouraged to like do things that way. But you don't have to design a game that way. And in fact, like World of Warcraft has been kind of moving away from those types of activities that you have to do in a particular time. You have to do like every day for a particular amount of time every day, or otherwise you don't get the rewards. So World of Warcraft has kind of tried to like move away from that, and I think that has been like an improvement for the game. But yeah, so I think you're right that there's ties to like the addictive elements there.
Yeah, just so everyone's clear, like so our position isn't that like gaming is like perfect and things like that. And just tying it to like, so then someone might be like, well, you earlier said it wasn't addictive. Well, the point is like those elements can be pulled out of the game. And like, so if we're describing people who are like, oh, I'm now burdened of having to go home and play this game so I can play this other game, like these people are not enjoying what they're doing. So if we could remove those elements, right, then we are like actually improving the experience. And so that's just to say, like, it's unlike the other objects of addiction, and there are some bad parts of gaming, but those can be improved upon.
I wonder if it's fair to say that there's nothing intrinsically wrong about video games or intrinsically good about video games. They're intrinsically neutral.
I think that's right. I mean, it's just like a medium, right? So like if someone just said like music, good or bad, like, well, like I'd be like, good, like I most likely good. But yeah, I mean, I think it probably, yeah, depends upon a lot about, I think on the whole, if we just said like, what about the average game? The average game made, is that like a good or bad experience? I mean, I would probably say it's good experience. It like people enjoy playing it. It probably has like some interesting story and design elements that are worth engaging with. People are like going to make friends over this. That's good.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of like often focus on the negatives of gaming, like the violence and historically the violence and addiction, and also just this idea that we're wasting time in doing it. But I think like one of the things that we really wanted to do is just show that there are all these ways in which gaming can build character, build relationships, help us, give us a medium to play, and that's good, right? And I think that is something that's often not emphasized or not talked about as much as the negatives. And so yeah, like gaming itself is probably it's such a broad medium that it's going to be neutral. It's going to depend on like the content of the game and the way in which the gamer is playing the game. But I think our point is just to try to emphasize that there are these positives to gaming that are often missed out on, or not necessarily mentioned as much as the negatives.